The silence in the grand ballroom of the Dewberry Hotel was so heavy it felt like it was pressing the oxygen right out of my lungs. 600 of Charleston's most elite citizens, lawyers, developers, and old money socialites, sat in stunned, frozen poses, their forks halfway to their mouths, their champagne flutes ignored. But my gaze wasn't on the crowd. My eyes were locked onto table 14. There sat my mother, Martha Fitzgerald, her face the color of the white linen tablecloth. Next to her, my sister Penelope, the golden child, the pride of the family, was staring at me as if I had just grown a second head. 3 weeks ago, at a private Thanksgiving dinner with these same people, my mother had stood up and introduced me to her friends, not as her daughter, but as the help. She had laughed, that high-pitched, tinkling laugh that sounded like breaking glass, and told 14 people that while Penelope was out saving lives as a dermatologist, I was just the maid who kept the family estate from falling into squalor. I looked down at the $1.9 million award for excellence in luxury service glinting under the stage lights. I could still feel the phantom sting of the tears I had shed in the kitchen that night while I scrubbed the grease off their fine china. I remembered the way my father, Gerald, had kept his head down, refusing to meet my eyes while his wife and eldest daughter treated me like a stray dog they were barely tolerating. But the girl who cried in that kitchen was gone. In her place stood the CEO of the fastest-growing concierge empire in the Southeast. I leaned into the microphone, the feedback whining slightly through the massive speakers, and I repeated the exact words my mother had hissed in my ear before I walked out of that dinner. I remember you told me that some people are born to lead and others are just born to clean up after them. I said, my voice cold, steady, and amplified for every single person in that room to hear. You told those 14 people that I was the maid. Well, Mom, you were half right. I do clean up messes, but what you didn't realize is that for the last 2 years, my company has been the one cleaning up your mess. I own the resort you're staying in. I own the service that manages your life. And tonight, I'm the one holding the microphone while you're the one who's gone completely silent. I watched as a vein throbbed in my father's forehead. I watched as Penelope's husband, Arthur, tried to shrink into his chair. They had come here tonight to network, to be seen with the visionary of Charleston, never imagining that the visionary was the same daughter they had tried to bury in the shadows of their own arrogance. Before I tell you what I said next, the sentence that effectively erased the Fitzgerald name from polite society, you need to understand the path that led to this stage. It didn't start with $1 million contract. It started with a lifetime of being told I was invisible. My name is Miranda Vance, and I'm 30 years old. I grew up in the historic district of Charleston, South Carolina, a place where the houses are grand, the gardens are manicured to perfection, and the secrets are buried deep beneath layers of thick Southern hospitality. In our circles, the Fitzgerald name carried immense weight. My father, Gerald, was a prominent developer who shaped the city's skyline, and my mother, Martha, was the self-appointed queen of every charity gala and social committee in the state. To the outside world, we were the definition of old money success, the perfect Fitzgeralds. But inside those white pillared walls, there was a hierarchy as rigid and cold as any military unit. At the very top of that hierarchy was my sister Penelope. She was the golden child, the straight-A student who went on to become a high-end dermatologist with a practice that catered to the city's elite. My parents didn't just love her, they worshipped the ground she walked on. Every trophy, every degree, and every minor accomplishment she achieved was celebrated like a national holiday. And then there was me. I wasn't a doctor, a lawyer, or a socialite. I was just Miranda. I was the daughter who stayed behind to help my mother with the dirty work of her events, the logistics, the cleaning, and the heavy lifting, all while being treated like I was a background character in my own life. Before we dive into the heart of this story, into the betrayal that nearly broke me and the silent empire I built out of the ashes, please take a moment to support the channel. If you believe that no one should ever be shamed for their work or treated like a second-class citizen by their own blood, hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us continue sharing these stories of resilience and justice. Also, please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're watching from right now and what the time is. I try to read as many as I can, and it's truly incredible to see how far our community reaches. Now, to understand why my mother felt so comfortable calling me a maid in front of her friends, you have to understand the deep-rooted dynamic of our household. It wasn't just a lack of attention, it was a deliberate casting of roles. Penelope was the future, I was the utility, and as long as I stayed in my place, the Fitzgerald machine ran perfectly. But I was done being a cog in someone else's dream. The Fitzgerald estate on East Bay Street was a masterpiece of Southern architecture: white pillars, wide porches, and a garden that looked like it belonged on the cover of a magazine. But inside those walls, the air was always thin, especially for me. My mother, Martha, treated the house like a stage. Everything had to be perfect, because at any moment a neighbor or a member of her garden club might drop by. In her world, if it didn't look expensive, it didn't exist. And unfortunately, as I grew up, I realized that I was one of the things she preferred didn't exist. The most prominent feature of our living room was what we called the legacy wall. It was a grid of 12 gold leaf frames. 11 of those frames were dedicated to my sister, Penelope. There was Penelope at her debutante ball, Penelope graduating from medical school, Penelope receiving her white coat, and Penelope at her high-end dermatology clinic. The 12th frame? That was me. It was a photo from my high school graduation, tucked away in the bottom right corner, often partially obscured by a large decorative fern. Whenever guests came over, Martha would lead them to the wall like a museum curator. "This is our Dr. Penelope," she beamed, her voice thick with practiced pride. If anyone happened to notice my photo and asked who I was, Martha's smile would falter just a fraction. "Oh, that's Miranda. She's very practical. She helps me keep the household running." Practical. That was the word they used to bury my dreams. While Penelope was encouraged to study until 2 a.m. to become a doctor, I was the one handed the grocery list and the vacuum cleaner. I remember my 16th birthday clearly. There was no big party, no car with a bow, no celebration of me. Instead, Martha had organized a fundraiser for the local children's hospital, an event designed to boost Penelope's medical school application. I spent my entire birthday in a black and white server's outfit, carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres to people who didn't even know I was the daughter of the house. I remember standing by the buffet table, my feet aching, watching my father, Gerald, give a toast to the brilliance of the Fitzgerald women. He looked right past me, to Penelope. He wasn't a mean man, not in the traditional sense. He was just absent. He was an accountant who viewed life through a ledger. If a child didn't bring home a high-status degree, they were a liability on the family balance sheet. I tried so hard to be seen. I studied, I worked, I maintained a 3.8 GPA, but in a house that only valued gold, my silver was treated like lead. I remember one evening after Penelope had been accepted into her residency, my mother was posting on Facebook. I sat on the sofa next to her and watched her type. "So proud of my only daughter for achieving her dreams. Dr. Penelope is officially a resident." My heart physically hurt. "Mom," I whispered, "I'm right here. I'm your daughter too." She didn't even look up from her screen. "Don't be so sensitive, Miranda. You know what I meant. You're my helper. You're the one who makes all of this possible. That's a gift in its own way." That was the moment I realized they didn't see a person when they looked at me. They saw a utility. I was the one who knew how to get the wine stains out of the heirloom tablecloths. I was the one who could organize a 3-course meal for 20 people on 2 hours' notice. I was the one who fixed the Wi-Fi, managed the landscapers, and dealt with the messy realities of life so that they could remain perfect in the eyes of Charleston society. I thought that if I did it well enough, they would eventually love me. I thought that if the house was clean enough, the silver polished enough, and the events ran smoothly enough, Martha would finally post a photo of me and call me her pride. But you can't earn love from people who only see you as a tool. I was 22 when I realized that being the invisible daughter gave me one massive advantage. I knew how the world worked. While Penelope was busy in a sterile lab, I was in the trenches. I knew the names of the best plumbers, the most discreet cleaners, and the high-end caterers. I knew how to manage people, how to negotiate contracts, and how to spot a problem before it even started. I started to build a mental database of every wealthy family in Charleston, their secrets, their needs, and the things they were too important to do for themselves. The Fitzgeralds had raised me to be a servant in my own home, but they had inadvertently given me the best education an entrepreneur could ask for. I began to realize that Charleston was full of people like my parents, people who had everything but didn't know how to take care of anything. They needed someone like me, not just a maid, but a ghost, someone who could make their problems disappear without a trace. While they were busy ignoring me, I was busy observing them, and as I scrubbed their floors and organized their lives, I started to put aside every dollar I could find. I was done being their maid. I was becoming their master, and they were too blinded by their own arrogance to notice the empire rising right under their noses. Thanksgiving in the Fitzgerald household wasn't a holiday, it was a high-stakes production. In November 2023, the air in Charleston was crisp, but the atmosphere inside our home on East Bay Street was suffocating. My mother, Martha, had been in director mode for weeks. The guest list was locked at 14, the absolute cream of our social circle. There were the Mercers, our neighbors who owned half the commercial real estate in the city, Dr. Stephanie Brennan, a colleague of Penelope's, and several high-ranking members of the Historical Society. While Penelope spent the morning at a luxury spa getting a glow-up for the evening, I was in the kitchen by 5 a.m. My hands were stained with the juices of the 24-pound turkey, and my back already ached from lifting heavy crates of heirloom china. I didn't mind the work, I actually took pride in it, but what hurt was the invisibility of the labor. Martha would breeze into the kitchen every hour, not to help, but to critique. Miranda, the silver has a smudge. Miranda, the stuffing needs more sage. Do try to look presentable before the guests arrive. We have a reputation to uphold. By the time 6 p.m. rolled around, the house smelled of rosemary and expensive perfume. I had cooked a 5-course meal entirely from scratch. I had ironed the linens, arranged the centerpiece with flowers I'd hand-picked, and even fixed a leak in the guest bathroom that the plumber couldn't get to in time. I was exhausted, sweat dampening my hairline, but I quickly changed into a simple charcoal gray dress, the most practical thing I owned, and stepped out to serve. The dining room was a sea of candlelight and forced laughter. I spent the first hour acting as a ghost. I refilled wine glasses with the $200 Cabernet that Penelope had claimed she had picked out. I had actually researched and bought it. I cleared appetizer plates before they could clutter the mahogany table. Not a single person at that table, people who had known me for 2 decades, asked me to sit down. To them, I was just part of the architecture, like the velvet curtains or the crown molding. Then came the moment that changed my DNA forever. Martha stood up at the head of the table, her wine glass raised, her pearls shimmering under the chandelier. The room went quiet. "I want to take a moment to thank you all for being here," she began, her voice dripping with that polished Southern charm. "Family is everything to Gerald and me, and we are so blessed with our daughters." She turned her beaming smile towards Penelope. As many of you know, our eldest, Dr. Penelope, was just featured in the Southeastern Medical Journal. She's not just a brilliant dermatologist, she's a visionary. She's the future of this family's legacy. To have a daughter who saves lives and achieves so much, well, it's a mother's greatest pride. The guests erupted in polite applause. Penelope leaned back, soaking it in like a desert plant in a rainstorm. But then Martha's eyes shifted to me. I was standing near the sideboard, a pitcher of iced water in my hand, waiting for a break in the speech to refill glasses. The smile on Martha's face didn't disappear, but it changed. It became thinner, almost mocking. "And then, of course, we have Miranda," she said, letting out a light, tinkling laugh that felt like a slap to my face. "One daughter is a doctor, a true leader. The other one, well, she's our little secret weapon. She cleans the houses, she manages the messes, and she keeps our lives running. She's essentially the maid, but at least she's a useful one, right?" The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the laughter started. It began with Mr. Mercer, a deep belly laugh, followed by the high-pitched giggles of the church ladies. Even Penelope lit out a smirk, whispering something to Dr. Brennan that made them both chuckle. 14 people, my family, my neighbors, my parents' oldest friends, sat there and laughed at me. I looked at my father, Gerald. He didn't laugh, but he didn't stop them either. He just stared at his plate, meticulously cutting his turkey as if it were the most important task in the world. His silence was louder than the laughter. It was the sound of a father who had decided his daughter's dignity wasn't worth the price of an uncomfortable social moment. The maid. The words felt like hot lead in my veins. I wasn't just a daughter who was practical anymore. I'd been officially demoted in front of the world. My mother hadn't just made a joke. She had issued a public decree of my worthlessness. She had looked at the woman who had spent 15 hours sweating over a stove to make her look like the perfect hostess, and she had labeled me a servant. I set the water pitcher down on the sideboard. The glass hit the wood with a sharp thud that cut through the laughter. Every head at the table turned toward me. "Is something wrong, Miranda?" Martha asked, her eyebrows arched in fake concern. "We're just having a little fun. Don't be so sensitive." I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me, the kind of clarity that comes when you finally realize you're fighting for a seat at a table that was never meant for you. "You're right, Mom. Sensitivity is for people who have a place here, and since I'm just the maid, I think it's time I finished my shift." I walked out of the dining room. I could hear Martha calling after me, "Miranda, don't you dare walk away while we're eating. Think of the guests." I didn't stop. I walked through the kitchen, past the piles of dirty pots and the remains of the feast I had prepared. I grabbed my car keys from the hook by the door and walked out into the cool Charleston night. I didn't take a coat, I didn't take a suitcase, I just took the realization that the version of me they knew, the useful, invisible, practical Miranda, had died in that dining room. As I drove away from the white pillars and the manicured lawn, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes were burning, but I didn't let a single tear fall. I had been their maid for 30 years. I had cleaned their houses, protected their secrets, and built their comfort on the bones of my own dreams. But as the city lights of Charleston blurred past me, I made a vow. If they wanted a maid, I would give them one. I would build an empire of service so vast and so powerful that they wouldn't even be able to afford the tip. I was going to turn their insult into my industry. They thought they had buried me, but they had just given me the fuel I needed to burn their world down and build my own from the ashes. I ended up in a tiny one-bedroom apartment in North Charleston. It was a far cry from the high-ceilinged mansion on East Bay Street. The walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbor's television, and the air always smelled faintly of old coffee and industrial-strength cleaner. But for the first time in 30 years, the air belonged to me. I had exactly $3,200 in my savings account, money I'd scraped together from grocery change and side jobs I'd done in secret over the years. My family thought I had nothing because they never looked closely enough to see what I was building. The first few months were a blur of exhausting, back-breaking labor. I didn't start as a CEO, I started as a woman with a vacuum cleaner and a vision. I took every cleaning job I could find. I was cleaning toilets in the morning, scrubbing grease off stovetops in the afternoon, and organizing chaotic pantries late into the night. It was mindless work to most, but to me it was a masterclass in human psychology. I began to notice a pattern among the wealthy residents of Charleston's most exclusive neighborhoods. Their houses were beautiful, but their lives were in absolute shambles. Remember my first real client, Mrs. Gable? She lived in a 7,000-square-foot home that was immaculately decorated, but her kitchen counter was buried under a mountain of unpaid bills, expired prescriptions, and half-finished projects. She was drowning in the logistics of her own existence. One Tuesday, while I was supposed to be mopping her floors, I asked if I could help her organize her mail. By the end of the day, I had sorted her life into neat, color-coded folders. I had called the repairman for her leaking roof, scheduled her doctor's appointments, and even arranged for a florist to bring fresh lilies every Friday. Mrs. Dable looked at the organized chaos and started to cry. "No one has ever actually seen the mess," she whispered. "You're not just a cleaner, Miranda. You're a ghost that fixes things." That was the aha moment. I realized that the ultra-wealthy don't just want clean, they want invisible. They want their lives to run like a clock without ever having to see the gears turning. They want control without the effort of controlling. I realized I could give them exactly what my parents and Penelope had always used me for, but this time I was going to charge a premium for it. On September 12, 2024, I filed the paperwork for Pristine Concierge LLC. The filing fee was a drop in the bucket, but it felt like signing my own Declaration of Independence. I didn't tell my parents. When my mother called to complain that her laundry wasn't folded the way she liked, I simply told her I was busy with my own clients. She laughed and said, "Well, I hope they pay you enough for extra bleach, dear." I didn't correct her. I let her believe I was still just the maid she had labeled me to be to make herself feel better. The first year of Pristine Concierge was brutal. I worked 18-hour days. I hired my first two employees, Maria, a meticulous housekeeper I'd met through Mrs. Gable, and Daniel, a former luxury car driver who knew every back road in the city. We weren't just a cleaning service, we were a life management firm. If a client needed a private chef at 4 a.m., we found one. If their yacht had a leak in the middle of the night, we had a mechanic on site before they even woke up. We became the secret architects of Charleston's high society. By the end of the first year, we had 12 steady clients and were generating about $4,000 a month in revenue. It was barely enough to keep the lights on, and there were nights I sat on my floor eating cold ramen, wondering if I had made a mistake. But then came the breakthrough. I got a call from a woman named Victoria Ashford. Now, if you know anything about the luxury hospitality world in the South, the Ashford name is royalty. Victoria owned the Murata, a 120-room luxury resort where rooms started at $900 a night. It was the jewel of the coast. Victoria had fired her previous housekeeping contractor after a major scandal involving theft and poor quality control. She needed a new vendor, and she needed one fast. When I walked into her office at the resort, I didn't wear a maid's uniform. I wore a sharp navy blue blazer and carried a leather-bound portfolio. Victoria looked at me with eyes that could cut through stone. "Everyone promises discretion and quality, Miss Vance. What makes you different?" I thought about my mother's legacy wall. I thought about the 14 people laughing at me while I refilled their water. I looked Victoria in the eye and said, "I've spent my entire life being invisible in a family that worshipped excellence. I know how to make other people feel like the center of the universe while I remain a ghost. I don't just manage rooms, I manage reputations, and I never, ever fail." Victoria stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. Then she slid a contract across the desk. It was for $28,000 a month. It was an 18-month term. My hands were shaking beneath the table, but my signature was steady. That contract changed everything. I hired 20 more employees. I implemented quality control systems that I'd developed from years of observing my mother's perfectionism. I created a training manual that taught my staff to be shadows, to anticipate a guest's needs before the guest even knew they had them. We didn't just clean the Murata, we transformed it. Within 6 months, guest satisfaction scores were the highest in the resort's 50-year history. Victoria was so impressed, she introduced me to her friends, owners of other boutique hotels, private island estates, and luxury spas. The Pristine Concierge brand became the gold standard for the invisible elite. We weren't a service, we were a status symbol. If you had Pristine managing your life, it meant you were truly successful. By the end of 2025, Pristine Concierge had 38 full-time employees and 10 part-time contractors. We moved out of my apartment and into a sleek, minimalist office in the Scottsdale Air Park. I was no longer the girl scrubbing grease. I was the CEO managing a logistics empire. Our gross revenue for the year was on track to hit $1.9 million. I lived in a modest but beautiful apartment in Old Town. I drove a reliable car. I didn't wear designer labels to show off. I wore the same simple sweaters and jeans when I visited my parents. Every time I saw them, my mother would ask, "So, how's the cleaning going, Jasmine? Found any good coupons lately?" I would just smile and say, "It's going well, Mom, same as always." I was a millionaire, and the people who lived in the same house as me had no idea. They were so blinded by the Maid label they'd slapped on my forehead that they couldn't see the crown I was actually wearing. They thought they were the ones who owned the city, never realizing that the very resort they stayed in, the very car service they used, and the very events they bragged about were all managed by the daughter they called a failure. I was building my empire in total, beautiful silence, and as the date for the Arizona Rising Entrepreneur Award approached, I knew the silence was about to become the loudest sound they had ever heard. It was December 10th, 2025, just 8 days before the Arizona Rising Entrepreneur Award ceremony. I was sitting in my office in the Scottsdale Air Park, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the desert sunset. My desk was covered in final reports, contract renewals, and the navy blue dress I had just picked up from Nordstrom. For a moment, I felt a sense of peace. I had built this. I had turned the Maid label into $1 million empire. But as I've learned, the past has a way of catching up to you exactly when you think you've outrun it. My phone buzzed on the mahogany desk. It was an email notification. The sender was Aunt Colleen, my mother's younger sister. Colleen was the only one in the family who had ever shown me even a sliver of genuine kindness, though she was often too intimidated by my mother, Martha, to speak up. The subject line read, FWD, Christmas Gala and the Miranda situation. Underneath, a short note from Colleen said, Miranda, I sent this to you by mistake months ago and you never replied. I'm sending it again because I can't sleep at night knowing this is how they talk about you. I'm sorry I was too much of a coward to say anything sooner. I scrolled down. What I found wasn't just a single email. It was a digital graveyard of my dignity. It was an email chain dating back 18 months, containing 47 messages between my mother, my sister Penelope, and Aunt Colleen. The very first email, dated June 2024, had the subject line, What to do about Miranda? I felt the blood drain from my face as I read my mother's words. Martha had written, Girls, I need your advice. The Historical Society Gala is coming up, and I don't know what to do about Miranda. I don't want her there making conversation with guests. What if someone asks what she does for a living? I can't keep explaining away the embarrassment of her having no real career like Penelope. It's easier to just have her stay in the kitchen and manage the caterers. We can tell people she's our private coordinator or something. Penelope's reply came 3 hours later, dripping with the same arrogance I'd endured my whole life. Agreed, Mom. Honestly, she's so useful in the background. If she's at the table, she just brings down the mood. Just tell her it's a high-level networking event and she'd be bored. She's so easy to manage. She'll believe whatever you tell her as long as you make her feel useful. I kept scrolling, my breath hitching in my throat. I saw messages where they laughed about forgetting to invite me to Sunday dinners because it was cleaner when it was just the successful members of the family. I saw my father, Gerald, CC'd on every single one of these emails. He never replied, but he never stopped them either. His silence wasn't just avoidance, it was a digital signature of his consent. But the worst was yet to come. I reached the emails from November 2025, just days before the Thanksgiving dinner that had broken my heart. Martha had written, I want to make a point this year. People are starting to ask why Miranda is always the one serving. I'm going to give a toast. I want to settle her place once and for all so she stops getting these ideas about starting a business. I'm going to call her the Maid. It'll be a joke, but it'll remind her where she belongs. Penelope had responded with a laughing emoji. Perfect, Mom. After that, she'll be too embarrassed to even think about anything else. It's for her own good, really. Some people are just born to serve. It's for her own good. The same phrase they used when they burned my dreams, now written in cold black and white text. I sat there in my multi-million-dollar office, surrounded by the evidence of my success, and I realized that my entire life in that house was a coordinated script. My humiliation wasn't an accident. It wasn't my mother being thoughtless. It was a planned, documented execution of my self-esteem. I didn't cry. The time for tears had ended in that CVS parking lot after Thanksgiving. Instead, I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. I realized that as long as I stayed silent, I was participating in their lie. They didn't just exclude me, they organized it. They didn't just underestimate me, they actively worked to keep me small so they could feel big. I created a new folder in my secure drive and named it The Execution. I forwarded all 47 emails to that folder. I then took a screenshot of my mother's Maid plan and the $1.9 million revenue report from my company. I looked at the two images side by side. My mother had wished in writing that she only had one daughter. Penelope had called me easy to manage. Gerald had watched it all happen from the CC line. They thought they had buried me in the dirt, but they had no idea they were looking at a volcano. I picked up the phone and called my assistant. "Cancel the reserved table for the Fitzgerald family at the awards gala," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's. "Actually, no, keep it. I want them there. I want them in the front row. I want them to have the best view in the house when the Maid they created finally takes the stage." I closed my laptop. The silence in the office was no longer heavy, it was powerful. I wasn't going to lower myself to their level of petty emails and secret group chats. I was going to do something much more devastating. I was going to let the truth speak for itself in front of 600 people. The Fitzgeralds had spent 18 months writing my downfall. I was going to spend 8 minutes finishing their story. The grand ballroom was a sea of crystal and silk. I watched from the wings as table 14 laughed and toasted. My mother, Martha, was leaning in, whispered something to Mrs. Mercer, probably another jab at my practical nature. They had no idea that the invitation they received hadn't come from a client of mine, but from the organizers who were honoring me. The MC, James Whitman, stepped up to the podium. "Tonight we honor a woman who redefined luxury in South Carolina. She started with a vacuum and a vision, and today her company, Pristine Concierge, manages the very resort we are standing in. This year alone, her firm generated $1.9 million in revenue. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our rising entrepreneur of the year, Miranda Vance." The room erupted. I stepped into the spotlight, the navy blue dress shimmering. I didn't look at the crowd, I looked at my mother. Her wine glass didn't just shake, it shattered on the table. The color left her face so fast, I thought she might faint. Penelope was frozen, her mouth open, staring at the screen behind me, where my company's logo and my CEO portrait were displayed in 20-foot high definition. I reached the podium and adjusted the mic. The silence was absolute. "Thank you," I began, my voice echoing. Most people think success is about the finish line, but for me, it was about the starting point. It was about being told I was a maid in a house I was supposed to call home. It was about 47 emails sent between people who shared my last name, discussing how to hide me because I was an embarrassment to their legacy. I saw my father, Gerald, flinch as if I'd struck him. "I spent years cleaning up your messes," I said, looking directly at table 14. "I ironed your clothes, organized your galas, and protected your secrets. And while you were busy writing emails about how easy to manage I was busy managing the elite of this city. You called me the maid to humiliate me. But tonight, I accept this award as the woman who owns the company that makes your lifestyle possible. You didn't bury me, you just gave me the dirt I needed to build an empire." I lifted the heavy glass trophy. To anyone out there who has been made to feel like a spare part or a shadow in their own home, I want you to remember this. Your value is not defined by the labels people slap on you to make themselves feel bigger. You are not the boxes they try to fit you in. You are the architect of your own future. Build your empire in the quiet, grow in the silence, and one day the truth of who you are will be the only thing the world can hear. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, share your journey in the comments. Remember, you were never meant to be invisible. You were just waiting for the right light. Thank you for seeing me.